Tug Hill Plateau,
New York, October of 1893. The air hung thick with wet soil and rotting maple, winter's first whisper. Across the scarred ground of the recently abandoned Carthage Iron Company, a man was doing something no one could pass. He was scrubbing out a furnace, not stripping it for salvage, not harvesting scrap iron. He worked with the deliberate tenderness of someone preparing a dwelling. The structure, a cold blast stack, a 30-foot pyramid of stone, stood surrendered to wind and rain. Sandstone blocks wore stains of rust and neglect. Iron fittings had been stripped away long ago. To the few families still clinging to the company town, this was a gravestone for a dead industry. To Andrei Harashko, it was something else entirely. Truman Esbrook, the former charcoal iron foreman, reined his wagon to a halt. His expression hardened into professional incredulity. He had overseen the construction and operation of a dozen stacks just like this one. He knew their anatomy, their weaknesses,
their temperament.
"Harashko," he called out, voice edged with the weight of authority. "What in God's name are you doing? That's not a house. It's a tomb." Andrei, compact, his shoulders carved by decades of brutal labor, gazed down from the charging hole. He did not raise his voice. When his words came, they barely pierced the autumn wind. "It will be warm." Esbrook turned to Silas Croft, who leaned against a nearby fence post and let out a sharp laugh. "Warm with damp and lung fever. The man is mad. He'll bury his family before spring arrives." Croft chewed a straw slowly, nodding. "It's a foolish business. Stone sweats. Everyone knows that." Ben Patcher, jobless since the furnace went dark, just shook his head. "The Slovak is chasing ghosts, trying to live inside the work that left us all behind." The ridicule never stopped. A steady drone of certainty from men who understood the savage arithmetic of a Tug Hill winter. They knew clapboard and timber, horsehair plaster and wool blankets. They knew the endless, grinding war against the cold, a war you fought every day and never won. Living inside a derelict industrial stack wasn't merely odd, it was lunacy, a direct assault on the hard-earned wisdom of the frontier. What could this furnace tender, this Vysoka Pek Hutnik, possibly grasp about thermal mass that a seasoned iron foreman and a settlement of weathered New York homesteaders had overlooked? What secret did he read in the dead stones of a cold furnace that they perceived only as wreckage? The answer would not merely rescue his family. It would rewrite the rules of survival on one of the most punishing landscapes in America. But first came the labor, the scorn, and the snow. If you have ever felt bitter cold bleeding through your own walls and wondered whether some older, more fundamental approach to shelter existed, stay with me. You will encounter a principle of thermal science so potent and so plain, it was mastered centuries before modern insulation was conceived. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, what is the strangest, most unconventional home you have ever seen or heard of? Andrei Harashko was no carpenter, not a farmer, not a frontiersman schooled in the tradition of the American log cabin. He was a man of the Vysoka Pek, the high furnace. His life in the Spiš region of Slovakia had orbited the rhythmic birth and death of fire. He knew the exact weight of a charcoal basket, the sharp tang of limestone flux, the deep, resonant groan a furnace released as it cooled. His hands spoke the language of fire brick, the subtle grain of sandstone that clung to heat, and the glassy, treacherous nature of slag that refused to. For 20 years, he had diagnosed a furnace's condition without instruments. The color of flame at the tuyere told him one thing. The low murmur of the blast told him another. And the heat, still radiating from the stack's stone jacket hours after the fires were banked, that told him everything. He had carried his wife, Zuzana, and their two small children, Jan and Katerina, across an ocean for the promise of a foreman's wage at the Carthage Iron Company. They arrived in the autumn of 1892. The company gave them a standard house, a clapboard box thrown together in haste, barely more than a wooden tent. Their first winter on the Tug Hill Plateau was pure education in suffering. The cold there was not a force, it was a presence. It lived inside the walls. André remembered the shocking bite of the bare iron door latch against his hand each morning, a searing brand that burned his fingerprints away. He watched Zuzana struggle with sourdough starter that chilled and died, loaf after loaf coming out dense, sour, barely edible brick. The cold was something beyond discomfort. It was an anti-life force, halting fermentation itself.
The memory that haunted him most
Was ordinary. Sitting at their small table, writing a letter to his brother back home. He dipped the pen in the inkwell, wrote 3 words. On the 4th, the nib scratched dry. The ink had frozen solid in the middle of his sentence. That winter, the Harashko family was never truly warm. They burned through their wood allotment by February and spent the remaining weeks feeding the stove scavenged timber, green, smoky, desperate. They existed in perpetual twilight, crowded around a stove that devoured fuel with monstrous hunger, but returned only a tight circle of warmth. Step a few feet away, and the air turned glacial. Their breath condensed into crystalline ferns on the inside of the walls. They slept in coats beneath every blanket they owned, and still woke shivering, joints aching with a deep, penetrating cold. André saw the exhaustion pooling in Zuzana's eyes. He heard the cough that settled permanently in his children's chests.
he was a master of heat.
His entire trade was the management of thousands of degrees, and he could not keep his own family from freezing. The problem was not the stove. It was not a shortage of wood. The problem was the house itself. The conventional frontier cabin was a thermal sieve built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how heat behaves. Thin, uninsulated walls of clapboard or even log had almost zero capacity to store thermal energy. They formed a flimsy barrier, not a reservoir. Heat escapes through 3 mechanisms: conduction, convection, radiation. The standard cabin surrendered to all 3. Cold conducted straight through the wood and plaster. Wind, a permanent feature of the plateau, knifed in through 100 tiny gaps, driving relentless convective loops. Warm air from the stove climbed to the ceiling, surrendered its energy to the freezing roof, then sank back down as a chilling draft.
Families like the Crofts and the Patchers
Were living inside a machine engineered for maximum heat loss. Their only response was to burn more wood. An iron stove, glowing hot, would throw radiant heat, making the spot beside it tolerable. But that radiant energy struck the cold walls and vanished outward instantly. The walls themselves never absorbed warmth. They remained a constant cold presence, leaching heat from the air and from every body in the room. Staying warm meant generating heat faster than the house could bleed it away. An exhausting battle, an expensive one, and ultimately a losing one. That winter, Truman Esbrook noted in his company log, that the average family consumed 8 cords of hardwood. Axes ringing through frozen timber became the soundtrack of survival. Smoke pouring from a chimney was no signal of comfort. It was the visible exhaust of desperate, inefficient burning. Andrei Harashko survived that first winter. He knew he would not endure a second. When the iron company collapsed in the summer of 1893, most workers packed up and left. Andrei saw not disaster, but raw material. Where others counted industrial skeletons, he counted stone trees, each with a heart designed to hold fire. He walked the line of abandoned furnaces, tapping sandstone blocks with a small hammer, listening. He was testing for integrity, the deep, solid ring of stone without major fractures. Furnace number 4 listed slightly, but its fire brick lining remained largely intact. His work began in September. First, cleaning. Decades of iron production had armored the interior with thick crust, slag, site soot, and a solidified iron deposit at the base, a salamander. For 2 weeks, he swung a heavy sledge and drove a crowbar, chipping and scraping until he reached the fire brick hearth beneath. Zuzana and the children hauled debris out in baskets. The neighbors watched the growing pile of black, glassy refuse. They shook their heads. Once the interior was stripped clean, Andrei began constructing his home inside the stone shell. He was not going to live pressed against those cold outer walls. He framed a modest 2-room cabin, 14 by 20 feet across the widest stretch of the stack floor. But here was the crucial detail. He left a gap of nearly 2 feet between his fresh wooden walls and the furnace's inner fire brick. Not insulation, not in any modern sense. This was a buffer zone for air that the structure itself would warm. Truman Esbrook came by during this phase. The foreman carried no paycheck anymore, but he still carried authority. His boots ground against stone chips as he walked the furnace interior. He dragged a palm across the molded fire brick. "Harashko, I've seen a dozen of these stacks torn down. They're riddled with cracks you can't see. Water gets in. The slag pockets are like sponges for damp." One thick finger jabbed toward the base where Andrei was laying a simple wooden floor. Come the January thaw, you'll have meltwater seeping in from the top and frost heaving from the bottom. This place will be a dripping rotten mess by Candlemas. You're building a coffin for your family. No malice in the delivery, pure professional verdict. And Esbrook had reason behind him. Stone structures on the Tug Hill were notorious for moisture, a legitimate, damning critique. Andrei stopped working, looked at the foreman. Didn't argue about water, didn't argue about rot. He said only this: "The stone must be warm first, then it will be dry." Esbrook shook his head and walked out. He'd done his duty. Now came the most ingenious piece of the entire design: the hearth. The furnace already had openings at its base, the tuyères, those pipes that once blasted air into the molten core. Andrei selected the largest of these arched openings. He sealed every other one with stone and clay. Into this single arch, he built his hearth and chimney for a small cast-iron stove. But the stovepipe didn't vent straight outside. Instead, it snaked upward, 20 feet through the main furnace stack before finally exiting. Every wasted degree from that chimney would be captured by the towering column of stone and brick above. He wasn't merely heating a small cabin. He was charging the entire furnace, slowly, deliberately, with warmth. The principle Andrei Harashko was exploiting carries a name: thermal mass. More precisely, thermal mass lag. One of the most elegant forces in thermal dynamics and the absolute inverse of the logic governing every clapboard cabin on the plateau. A material with high thermal mass, stone, brick, concrete, absorbs and stores enormous quantities of heat energy. Think of it as a battery, not for electricity, for warmth. A low-mass wall like wood holds almost nothing. Kill the stove in a cabin, and heat bleeds out in minutes. The walls have no stored energy to return. Andre's home sat inside 4 feet of dense sandstone and fire brick. Colossal thermal mass. When he lit that small, efficient stove, 2 things happened at once. First, the air inside his wooden cabin warmed for immediate comfort. But second, and far more important, a steady current of heat, measured in British thermal units, flowed into the millions of pounds of stone wrapped around him. Slowly, the stone absorbed it molecule by molecule. Days of continuous low-level burning to fully charge that stone battery. But once charged, the magic reversed direction. The release was just as slow. That is the lag. Picture an overnight plunge, 20 degrees Fahrenheit to -20. Inside a wooden cabin, the occupants feel it within the hour. The interior temperature chases the exterior almost instantly. But inside Andre's furnace home, the outer face of that 4-foot wall grows colder, yes, yet it takes hour after hour after hour for that cold front to bore through the stone. Meanwhile, the inner surface, saturated with days of stored heat, keeps radiating gentle, steady warmth into the living space. The furnace became a massive thermal flywheel. It didn't merely block the cold, it smoothed the savage temperature swings of the plateau into something almost calm. The stone absorbed the memory of the fire and refused to let it go. That 2-foot air gap Andre left was the final critical stroke. The inner stone wall radiated its warmth into this buffer, which gently heated the wooden walls of his actual cabin. He wasn't living in a stone tomb. He was living in a wooden house cradled inside a massive, low-temperature radiator. Truman Esbrook's dread of moisture proved equally groundless, and for the same reason. A cold stone wall pulls condensation from warm, humid air the way an ice-filled glass sweats on a summer table. But a stone wall held consistently warmer than the surrounding atmosphere never sweats. It does the opposite. It actively dries the space it encloses. Andre's plain declaration, ___, quote, _1, __, was not folk wisdom. It was a flawless compression of thermodynamic law into 6 words. Snow arrived in early November, soft at first, almost polite, then thickening into a daily assault that did not relent. By mid-December, the Tug Hill Plateau had disappeared. The land became a rolling white desert, carved and reshaped by wind. The official gauge at Lovell would eventually record 19 feet of total snowfall that winter. For 6 consecutive months, bare ground would not exist. Then came the cold. Not the bright, bracing cold of a clear winter morning, a different animal entirely, deep, motionless, invasive. It settled over the plateau and refused to leave. Mercury shrank into a stubborn bulb at 20 below zero, sometimes 22. In cold like that, the world turns brittle. Trees split open with cracks that sounded like rifle fire. Metal grew fragile. The air itself seemed to carry mass. For families still occupying the old company houses, existence shrank to a grim orbit around the stove. The war Andre had waged the previous year was now theirs. Silas Croft watched his woodpile shrink at a terrifying pace. His wife packed rags into every window frame. The drafts sliced through anyway. Their children developed raw, hacking coughs that rang through the frozen stillness. The same coughs the Harashko children had suffered a year before. At the Patcher place, the well pump seized solid. For 2 full weeks, Ben Patcher melted snow on the stovetop for every drop his family needed. Drinking, cooking, washing. The labor was enormous. The yield was pitiful. Inside furnace number 4, a different world existed. Mornings, Andre would rise and feed a few small logs into the stove. The fire never fully died. He banked it to coals each night. The air in their cabin was cool but not cold. Autumn cellar air. Still, calm, unbothered. No drafts. The wind's endless scream across the plateau reached them as a muffled whisper, a rumor from some other place. By mid-morning, with the stove producing steady, moderate heat, the cabin grew genuinely warm. And here, in the small domestic details, thermal mass performed its quiet miracle. Susanna found she could set her dough bowl on the floor beside the inner wall, and the bread would rise perfectly. That gentle, persistent warmth radiating from the stone was ideal for yeast. She baked twice a week. The smell of fresh bread, a scent of impossible normalcy, filled their home. Jan and Katerina played on the floor in shirt sleeves, fingers nimble enough to scratch drawings on their slates. The ink in Andre's inkwell stayed liquid, a deep, fluid black. One day, Susanna looked at her husband. A small, wondering smile crossed her face. "Quote 2, she said quietly. Quote 3. A simple observation, but it contained everything. Cold had been a constant thief, stealing dexterity, comfort, peace. Here, inside the stone, they were whole again. They burned less than 1/3 of the wood other families consumed, a small, steady fire instead of a roaring, desperate one. The stone performed the rest. By late January, accumulated snow became a structural threat. Truman Esbrook, hired by the Carthage Iron Company's receivers to assess remaining assets, was dispatched to survey the property. His task was grim. Count the furnace stacks whose charging roofs had buckled under the snow load. Dangerous work, done on snowshoes in cutting cold. One evening, as the winter sun bled out behind the western hills and deep blue twilight settled over the snowscape, Truman Esbrook was making his way back. He paused on a ridge, counted the dark shapes of furnaces against the white. Number 1, roof gone. Number 2, collapsed. Number 3, a jagged ruin. Then his gaze found number 4. The roof held. But that wasn't what stopped him. From its peak, a thin, nearly invisible thread of white smoke climbed straight into the motionless, frigid air. The smoke itself was not unusual. What stopped Esbrook cold was the ground at the furnace's base. Every other structure on the plateau, every tree, every fence post, stood buried beneath 6-foot drifts. The whole world had surrendered to white and blue. But around Andre Harashko's furnace, a perfect dark circle broke the pattern. Snow had melted clean away. Bare earth, black and damp, lay exposed in a ring 5 feet wide around the stone pyramid. The furnace was bleeding warmth, not through some wasteful chimney plume, but through its very foundations. Stone so deeply saturated with heat that it thawed the frozen ground surrounding it. Esbrook stood there a long while, cold, gnawing into his bones, staring at that impossible ring of bare earth. A flag of defiance driven into winter's heart. The quietest, most devastating rebuttal of his own expert judgment he had ever encountered. Not an argument, a fact inscribed on the land itself. Days later, curiosity finally conquering pride, Truman Esbrook walked to furnace number 4. He knocked on the heavy wooden door Andre had built. The Slovak opened it. Esbrook braced for the wave he knew, damp, stale, cellar air thick with chill. What met him instead was a silent tide of simple warmth. Not the scorching dryness of an overworked stove. A calm, pervasive comfort. The air carried baked bread and wood smoke. He stepped inside. 2 children playing quietly on the floor. Zuzana at a table, mending a shirt. A small stove holding a low, steady flame. His foreman's eyes hunted for the signs he expected. Water stains, frost creeping the walls, meltwater pooling on the floor. Nothing. The space was perfectly, impossibly dry. Andre said nothing, simply gestured him deeper inside. Esbrook, his mind warring with his eyes, crossed to the inner wall, the fire brick separating the wooden cabin from the stone mass. He expected neutral at best. At worst, cold brick leaching warmth from his hand. He pressed his bare palm against it. The brick was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm. Like a stone that had spent a full afternoon baking in summer sun. A gentle, steady radiation pushing outward. He noticed a small copper pot of stew resting on the floor, leaning against that same wall. Nearly noon. A thin wisp of steam still curling from its surface. __quote _4__. Andre said quietly, watching the foreman's gaze. That pot, still warm hours after the heat source was reduced, was the final, irrefutable proof. A domestic demonstration of a massive physical principle. The wall itself served as hearth. The entire furnace was a slow, colossal engine of warmth. Esbrook drew his hand back. He looked at Andre Harashko. The certainty, the professional pride, gone from his face. Replaced by something deeper, a quiet awe. Harashko hadn't merely built shelter to hold cold at bay. He had conscripted the stone itself as an ally, turning the furnace's sheer mass into a reservoir of heat. "You didn't build a house, Harashko," Truman Esbrook said, his voice rough with respect. "You built a season. You built a mild autumn that holds until spring." That winter, Truman Esbrook became Andre Harashko's loudest advocate. He told anyone who would listen. He brought Ben Patcher and Silas Croft to see the furnace themselves. They pressed their hands to the warm wall, saw the steaming pot, and left shaking their heads. No gloating from Andre. When they asked how, he explained it plainly. "The stone remembers the fire," he would say. He shared his knowledge freely. How to choose a sound stack, how to frame the inner room, how to vent the stove. He spoke of heat not as a fleeting comfort demanding constant generation, but as something to be stored, banked, saved. The idea, radical as it was, began to spread. The following year, an itinerant journeyman from Pennsylvania, part of a crew hired to dismantle some of the more ruined industrial sites, boarded with the Harashko family for a month in the autumn of 1894. Silas Croft was a carpenter, hands-on, sharp-eyed, allergic to nonsense. He watched Andre's winter preparations the way a surgeon watches another surgeon operate. And what he saw wasn't luck. It was architecture. He filled a notebook with sketches, the inner cabin nested inside the stack, the breathing gap between walls, the chimney threading up through the main flue. That notebook traveled with him to his next contract in the Adirondacks, where another cluster of dead charcoal furnaces stood rotting in the woods. By 1896, his letters back to Andre carried confirmation. 3 families near the McIntyre Ironworks had moved into furnace homes, all built on the Harashko pattern. The seed had caught. Old world knowledge carried across an ocean pressed into the frozen soil of the American frontier, spreading silently from one abandoned stack to the next. It never became a movement, never made headlines, but for a scattered few families in the coldest pockets of the North Country, it drew the line between endurance and suffering. The brilliance of Andre Harashko's furnace home wasn't novelty, the principle was ancient. What he executed on the Tug Hill Plateau followed the same logic behind Roman hypocausts, Korean ondol floors, the massive masonry stoves of his European homeland. He recognized something the frontier refused to see, that its addiction to lightweight, quick-built timber frames was a death sentence in a climate ruled by unrelenting cold. The answer wasn't hidden. It stood in plain sight, crumbling in the ruins of the very industry that had lured him there. Now, the most advanced thinking in sustainable construction and passive solar design circles back to this same root idea. Architects talk about tromba walls. Engineers model concrete slabs and phase change materials. Every one of them, a modern method for embedding thermal mass into a structure. Storing the sun's energy by day, releasing it through the night, slow and steady. They are rediscovering what Andre Harashko grasped by instinct. A home should not merely resist the elements, it should negotiate with them. There is a deep lesson buried in the stone walls of Furnace Number 4. In a culture that worships speed, novelty, the disposable, Andre Harashko looked at something the world had declared dead and useless. He saw its true, enduring power. He didn't invent something new to defeat the cold. He listened to what an old stone giant, built to cage industrial fire, still remembered about holding warmth. He understood that real resilience rarely comes from invention. It comes from recognition. The wisdom to see hidden strength in what we've already built. The humility to learn from the deep, slow memory of the Earth itself. If this exploration of thermal mass and frontier ingenuity meant something to you, consider liking and subscribing for more stories of practical genius. And tell us in the comments, what piece of obsolete technology do you believe still holds lessons we haven't learned? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while techniques and principles draw from real historical practices. Any application of building techniques should follow modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.